Hello everybody, I'm Simon, and today I'm going to deliver you guys an IOC of the poem Thetis written by Carolyn Duffy. And Thetis is an excerpt from The World's Wife, the collection of the poems written by Carolyn Duffy. And Duffy is a poet that mainly focuses on criticizing the issue of feminism in a society. And let's get started with the poem, the theme. So the theme of the poem is mainly focusing on uh, women need to be flexible in changing their forms in order to fit into the environment that they're forced up on by their male dominant side. At the same time, they need to try to take over their individuality and identity and dominant over their male partner. And in order to reach that, Duffy uses different literature techniques to develop the theme throughout the poem. And one of the most apparent one is the use of imagery throughout the poem. And there's another one which is symbolism. And I'm gonna start off with talking about the poem at the same time elaborating on how she uses those devices to um, develop the theme. So here is the poem Thetis, and so before I started, I want to mention how the poem is written. So the poem is written in in the dramatic monologue, which is the use of first person to describe the story, and the use of first person kind of also gives the readers the characteristics of the main character in the poem, who is Thetis in this context. And let's start off with the first paragraph. So the first paragraph, Thetis changes herself into a bird, and she talks about she mentions about singing, and I believe in the context of this poem, singing is a form of expressing herself and expressing her ideas, opinions. It's her freedom, and at the last line of the poem, as shown here, the squeeze of the fist. So the squeeze of the fist is absolutely being act by the mouth side, and the squeeze by squeezing the bird cannot sing, which kind of like also in is it's kind of like indicating how Thetis is being silenced by the mouth side, and then goes on to the next stanza. The next stanza, Thetis changes herself into albatross, which is also another form of bird, and it also mentions about the sky, and then and the sky. So like she's talking about how like flying in the sky as an albatross, and flying in the sky is another form of freedom that I believe she has, and and there's a man force occur at the end of the stanza. Uh, and there's a word crossbow as shown here, and crossbow is a symbol of I believe is a symbol of male dominance and then masculinity, and in this context it's kind of like the male partner is using the crossbow to shoot the albatross down in order to prevent her from flying away from him, and this is another way of the male side controlling female side. And then the third stanza, Thetis changes herself to snake, and what's interesting that snake is kind of different from the two objects that she changed before, bird and albatross. And bird and albatross are kind of like more gentle and more kind of like they're not harmful. And then snake in turn turned out that is more of an aggressive character. And then the use of snake, I believe, is also kind of like Duffy wants to convey to the audience that Thetis is changing herself throughout her experience, and she wants to become a more dominant side. And then but unfortunately, the male side is still controlling her, as shown in the last line of the stanza, the grasp. And the grasp is is also the male dominance force. And then the use of grasp is it's the same as squeeze. And then by grasping the snake or a fetus, the male side prevents fetus from running away from him, which is also another form of like the male's dominance and being in control of their female partner. And then the next paragraph, she Thetis changes herself into a meat eater as shown in the poem, as highlighted in red and in blue. And then and what's interesting in stanza 3 and stanza 4 is that both of the objects that Thetis changes into are carnivores, which is kind of like indicating the way that she's in changing herself into becoming a more dominant role. And but unfortunately there is a she's still being controlled, as shown in the last line. And it said there shown there as highlighted in green, the gun. And the gun is a symbol of masculinity and male dominance. And then the use of the gun to kind of like it's kind of like the male side uses gun to shoot the meat eater, which is a carnivore, which is an animal. And then by shooting them, those male, or in term they could be hunters, they are still in control of all the things of the female side. And preventing them from having their own voice and having their own freedom, as they're being the prey of the hunters. And then in stanza 5, Thetis changes herself into the sea, the animals in the sea. And as shown, as she and a lot of more animals as kind of like singing under the ocean. And as highlighted, the ocean's opera singer, and she's happy about singing. And singing goes back to the first stanza, is is a form of expressing herself, expressing her individuality and identity. And then the fisherman come. And the fisherman is describing the male side as well. And the fisherman uses the hook. The hook is a symbol of the male dominance. And those men uses the hook to try to catch Thetis under the ocean. And this also shows that how like the male side uses the their power to catch Thetis, and preventing her from having her own freedom. And then the next stanza, Thetis changes herself to all other form of small animals. And then the male side came to the site. And this one is what's interesting is that the male side in this stanza is described as taxidermist. And taxidermists are the people who uses the animal's body uh, to store their outside appearance, and take all the stuff inside throw it out. And then they uses the chemicals to keep the outside of the body fresh for exhibitions. And then by and also as shown in the poem, there's a knife. A knife is also a symbol of masculinity. And then by describing men as taxidermists, I feel like Duffy is indicating the characteristics of a male side, in terms of how they're objectifying women as their for man's entertainment. And they're not really and the men are not really fall in love with Thetis or with their female partner. And they only wanted to have the in control of their physical part instead of the soul of their female partner. um, and then the plot drastically changes. And then in the second last stanza, um, Thetis changes herself from a biotic factor to a abiotic factor, as shown as wind, gas, and hot air. And then a more drastic one she changes into is hurricane. And She describes herself as being a hurricane and roared at a fighter plane. And fighter plane in this context is the melt site. And this time is the first time that Thetis fighting back to the male dominance force, and I believe she successfully did it. And also, as I was mentioned throughout the poem, that she's been changing herself, and also as described in the theme, she's been changing herself throughout her experience in order to fit into the environment, and then taking over the dominant side. And as shown in here, as she's becoming a hurricane, a more dominant or more powerful object than the fighter plane. And then the last stanza. The last stanza, what's interesting is that she changes herself back. And then before she changes herself back, she wanted to kiss the her lover, and as shown in the third line, but the groom wore asbestos, and asbestos, I believe, are the plants that are resistant to fire, which kind of like also informs of indicating how Duffy believes that the males are immune to everything that female do to them. And it's also kind of like negatively indicating their characteristics. And then in the fourth line, Thetis realized that, and then she changed. She learned from all her experience of being oppressed and being in of being not being in control, and being silenced by the male part. And then she learned that lesson, and she turned her inside out, as mentioned in the second last line, turn inside out. And turn inside out basically means that she's turning her true self out to live, and also kind of like shows that how she realized the importance of individuality and her identity as well. And this is basically all the poem Thetis is talking about. As I was mentioned, the use of imagery throughout the poem gives the reader a sense of what's going on, and as the Thetis' life is progressing, and also the symbols of male dominance and the symbols of masculinity gives the poem a more vivid image to the reader to understand the poem. And these are all contributing to the fact that the theme of the poem, which is to encourage women being flexible in changing their forms in fitting to the environment and compromising their lover, and at the end they need to reach their goals of being independent and being themselves. Thank you.